Civil liberties were affected so much that some people start thinking that Cheney is acting as a dictator. Phones were taped, the airports are still a problem. Why is that? Because we have a fear of those people who want to set up the same Islamic political thought, Khilafah, that Osama wanted to establish, Mullah Omar wanted to establish. And Saudis are indirectly doing it because they appoint imams and all the way, and they try to manipulate the situation. But I was talking about the Iranian Revolution. The Iranian Revolution, the development of democracy in Iran, why it's affected the people's right, because our security problem in the United States is so bad, and we suffered so much due to these revolutionary Osamas and other peoples, that our own civil liberties affected. What I mean to say is that and we are superpower, when a small country like Iran, and we have everything on the table, and Israel has everything on the table, and we're trying to change regime, Congress is passing bills to pay for it, to disturb them. We have a group called Mujahideen Khalq that we finance them in spite of they're not legal or whatever, but indirectly they're carrying arms and they're staying in Iraq and causing problem for Iran. With all these problems, when Iranian people and the Iranian rulers have it, what would they do? Do same thing what we did, reduce the rights of the people, because they're fearful that anybody coming into this country is maybe agent, maybe he's going to do this, maybe some bomb is going to blast, maybe some. So I think the West has the responsibility, I don't say blame, to keep the Iranian people more suppressed. In 30 years, the war, we supported the war. Saddam came, but the West supported it. And Iran suffered for, I don't know, 10 years or whatever the war period was. Then after that, we have everything about whatever they're doing, that we or our Navy is sitting there. We're trying everywhere. The financial system has been disturbed. The inflation is horrendous because of the sanctions. If I could buy a thing here for $1, they have to pay probably $10 to get same thing because of the sanctions. We think the sanctions will help the people to come out and take the regime out, because they will get sick of it and they will bring again Shah's family or their relatives and friends back into Iran and let them run it, and they will be our friends. But it's not that easy. So I think what we're doing because of that, and same thing as we feel that are happening to us by these groups like Bin Laden and those people, same thing we're doing to Iran. And due to that, the development of democracy and their rights is not happening.
It was a chaotic time. The Shah eventually left in January 1979, and Khomeini returned from his exile in France in February 1979. Although looking back now, it's possible to trace the events of the revolution very clearly. At the time, it was one day of chaos followed by another day of chaos. I stayed until May '79 with just a few short trips, a couple of short trips back to London in that time. And I went out again to Tehran in November 1979 when the US Embassy was seized. I stayed there then for 6 months, eventually leaving in 1980. Not only was it often difficult to work out what the hell was happening from day to day, it was also difficult to put it either into a regional perspective or an historical perspective. But it was very clear it was a very historical time, not just in Iran, but also, I was going to say the Middle East, but in fact it's not really the Middle East, it's Iran, Afghanistan and Pakistan, with a bit of Saudi Arabia involved as well. I'll explain why. I had previously lived in Pakistan as a correspondent for the BBC and Financial Times in 1977 and 78. And it was because of my experience in surviving in Pakistan that the Financial Times, when it hired me afterwards, then sent me off to Iran, thinking that if I could survive Pakistan, I could probably survive Iran. Pakistan at that time was also going very much through its own turmoil. When I arrived in 77, 2 weeks and 2 days after I arrived, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was overthrown by the army. I used to tell people before I arrived in Pakistan that I knew 2 things about Pakistan. One was that it was to the left-hand side of India, and the other that it was run by a fellow called Bhutto. 2 weeks and 2 days after I arrived, my knowledge was halved. However, I got used to Pakistan, and then I realized there were bigger trends in the region than just Pakistan. In April 1978, President Dawood, the president of Afghanistan, was overthrown. He was a pro-Soviet president, but he was overthrown by communist parties in opposition to him. That was the start of the essentially the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, or the first part of it, and also the rise of Islamic fundamentalism as a political force in Afghanistan. When I was in Iran covering the hostage crisis, it was also a very busy time, and if communications had been as instant as they are now, I think I'd have been even more scared than possibly I was. You couldn't get CNN or anything like that. Telexes weren't working properly, telephones working properly. But I well remember the time when Islamic radicals took over the mosque in Mecca in Saudi Arabia, and at the same time, or within a day or so, Pakistani demonstrators laid siege to the US Embassy in Islamabad, essentially burning it down and almost incinerating the people who were hiding in the vault there, who were only rescued at the last moment. And the region was clearly in turmoil. Now, the conclusions I draw aren't necessarily the ones you perhaps want to hear, but I'll tell you what they are anyway, and they are my own personal conclusions. One is that the Shah was not a popular man in Iran, no doubt about it. He ran a tough regime and a cruel regime if you were in any way a political opponent of him. And yet, my judgment of the Islamic Revolution is that it